The first category I'm gonna kind of assign here is teams that I think are a coin flip or better for Iowa State. 45% or better type of category. I think in this category you can put SMU, you can put Clemson. This is gonna sound crazy, but Arizona State, and those three for sure. And I think Indiana as well. I think those four you put as 45% or better. Iowa State's within a point or two on the spread. Even if the other team is favored, Iowa State's within a point or two on the spread. All those teams, I think, they're fine teams that deserve to be in the playoff. But I think a few of those Iowa State matches up really well. Particularly if I'm looking at like Indiana and SMU, those are two teams that I think they played a fairly weak schedule within their own conferences. SMU lost to BYU, another Big 12 team. Those are both teams I think Iowa State's offense is able to get past. Clemson's an interesting one. I think Iowa State would have been right there. It'd been almost a push line. Maybe Clemson's a favorite by a point or two. Clemson's got a lot of blue chip talent, which makes it a little bit more difficult for a team like Iowa State that's working with lots of 3-star, maybe some low 4 stars, but mostly 3-star kind of blue collar talent. That talent disparity shows up a lot, like in the trenches. Where Iowa State was fine this year. The offensive line was better than the defensive line, but not awesome. But I think Iowa State would have had a decent shot against those ones. If you had to give me an order, Indiana and SMU seem like teams that Iowa State definitely probably. They'd probably be favored against SMU. They might be a 1-point dog to Indiana or a push. They'd probably be maybe a 2-point dog to Clemson. Arizona State's an interesting one, and I'm going to bring up Arizona State, even though I know that Arizona State blew out Iowa State in the bowl game or in the Big 12 championship. I'm aware of that. They were favored going into that Big 12 championship game. Technically, Arizona State was an upset. So that's certainly a team that Vegas believed Iowa State should beat. So I think those four. I think I guess actually the fifth one I would throw in there is the tricky one here is Boise State. Iowa State's roster, top to bottom, is probably better than Boise State's. But they have Ashton Jeanty, and the thing that we saw all year was, Iowa State's defense was fine. It wasn't as good as it has been in previous years. It's an interesting question to ponder is what Iowa State would have done with Ashton Jeanty. Maybe he goes off and he gets his, and he still has to work for it, but maybe he gets his, but Iowa State can still just kind of win the war of attrition type of thing. Little tough to say. That one, Ashton Jeanty being the player there bothers me a little bit, but I wouldn't say that bothers me any more than Cam Skattebo did. You can argue which one, if Ashton Jeanty or Cam Skattebo is the better player. I don't know. I can tell you that one, that feels like splitting hairs at that point. Give me Indiana, SMU, Clemson, Boise State, and Arizona State as 5 teams that I think Iowa State is, 45% odds or better. The next category I want to talk about here, I think is on the other end of the spectrum, is like you're talking need a miracle type, like Iowa State's 20% or below. They're a touchdown dog or worse, maybe 2-score dog. You're looking at Ohio State, you're looking at Oregon, you're looking at Georgia, and you're looking at Notre Dame. Those 4 teams, it'd have been a major uphill battle. Now it's funny though, when you go in, when we started this playoff, had Iowa State been, let's say Iowa State was a Big 12 champion or something like that, or let's say they're an at-large, let's say they had Tennessee's spot, let's say they were the 9 seed, and Ohio State was just coming off that Michigan loss, which everybody was familiar with how negative the PR around the Ohio State football program was after that Michigan loss. Now in hindsight, that loss might have been the best thing that ever happened to them, because as soon as it turned out, they turned into this juggernaut that looked like maybe the only team we've seen since then that could maybe hang with 2019 LSU. They were untouchable in the playoffs. So Ohio State is firmly in the would need an unusually bad game from Ohio State and an unusually good game from Iowa State and some bounces to make that happen. Georgia's probably the same way, that just the talent level there is just not compatible for a team like Iowa State that's dealing with lots and lots of 3-stars, that lots of developmental prospects, and dealing with so many injuries. Even a healthy Iowa State team, I don't think, is able to really compete with Ohio State or Georgia. Oregon's probably the same way. Maybe the case you make is that one, that Iowa State has played and beaten Oregon recently, and they've played against Dillon Gabriel recently. When he was at Oklahoma, they played against him. So they have some familiarity with Dillon Gabriel. Maybe you take that angle, but Oregon is really good. Notre Dame is, I guess, maybe the most beatable of those four for Iowa State, but I still think it's a pretty bad matchup. Notre Dame's offensive line is incredible. I would argue they're probably the best offensive line in college football. Notre Dame's not a high scoring team, so maybe you say they sell out to stop the run and you make Riley Leonard beat him with your arms and throw into that Iowa State secondary, which was very good this year. Maybe you do that, and then you can hopefully get something on offense. Maybe you can hit a bomb or two over the top. Maybe there's that universe, but I think it's a poor matchup for Iowa State in terms of Notre Dame's offense and Iowa State's defense. It's just a kind of a bad matchup. So now we get to this middle chunk here. You look at Texas, Tennessee, and Penn State. I think these are these are three really, really interesting matchups to look at. I mean, I would guess all three of them would be favorites against Iowa State, in the neighborhood. Tennessee, I would guess all of them would be in the neighborhood of like a 5-ish point favorite. I would guess 5, 6, 7, maybe somewhere in there. We'll start with Tennessee. Tennessee is a nice team with a good quarterback. They had a good offense this year, but Josh Heupel's teams have tended to not do as well in the big games. I mean, they can put up lots of points. They can beat good teams. I mean, they can beat anybody. But we also saw them lose to an Arkansas team that was fairly mediocre this season. And that Arkansas team lost to Oklahoma State, who was horrible. But, I think this is one where Iowa State gets an early score and just kind of forces Tennessee to throw the ball into the secondary. It's still an uphill battle. Iowa State's still an underdog in that matchup. If you can keep the ball out of Tennessee's offense, out of the hands of the Tennessee offense, you can play with Tennessee if you're Iowa State. That's what allows teams with lower talent levels to play with teams with higher talent levels, is just ball control, keep the ball out of their hands and be efficient with what you're doing. And Iowa State's offense was good at being efficient, being explosive when they needed to be, but moving the ball when they needed to as well. Texas is a team that just came from the Big 12, so Iowa State has a lot of familiarity with Texas. Texas was a good team, but I would not call them a dominant team. They have they had good players in the trenches. But we saw Arizona State take them to the wire in their playoff game. You could argue maybe Arizona State should have won that game. I put Arizona State and Iowa State, as far as a quality of team, especially if they're both healthy, I put them basically in the same category. If Arizona State is able to hang with Texas, Iowa State can hang with Texas. Texas is probably a 5 to 7 point favorite in that game. There's a clear path to victory there, because Iowa State has beaten Texas fairly regularly for the last 15 years. And I think this is a season that Iowa State absolutely would have had a shot against Texas. They would have had a game plan. They would have done it differently than Arizona State did, where Arizona State basically just handed it to one dude and said, go win us a football game. And he damn near did, and he tried to. But Iowa State doesn't necessarily have an alpha dog like Cam Scadaboo does, but they've got a couple guys. They had 2,000-yard receivers, and they've had some really nice players else around the ball. They had a good quarterback in Rocco Becht. It's a game that Iowa State has a decent shot to win. Penn State is one that I think is very, very interesting. Now, going into Happy Valley, if you just replace SMU with Iowa State, and Iowa State has to go to Happy Valley, obviously it's a difficult road game. However, if you watch Iowa State and Penn State on tape, they are darn near identical football teams. They play very similarly. They have very similar personnel. They both have very good tight ends. They both are very, very similar football teams. And there's absolutely a universe where Iowa State goes to Happy Valley and picks off Penn State. Because I think they just have a better, a more consistent offense than SMU, more firepower on offense than SMU does. And I have a secondary that can really bottle up Drew Aller. I think that's a game. Like I said, Penn State's probably maybe a 5-point favorite, maybe a touchdown favorite. There's a path to victory there for Iowa State, where you turn Penn State over a couple times and you stay efficient. You don't turn the ball over. Maybe make a couple field goals here and there, something like that. There's a path to victory over Penn State for Iowa State.